This last week at the North Carolina National Open, I met a debater named Daniel who says he's pretty new to debate, but he clearly has a mind for it and has read everything on the Ethos blog and clearly is consuming all kinds of information across homeschooldebate.com, the internet, and so on. I thought this guy was cool. He emailed me later this week asking me 3 questions, and I'm going to answer those 3 questions now using this whiteboard and me, rather than typing all this because I think this would probably take forever to type. So let me tell you the 3 questions. Question 1, negative strategy. I know you're a proponent of shell and extend. What does that look like when run properly, and why would it be better than a hybrid? We'll answer that first. Second, neg with no evidence. What mindset should I have to find arguments? I asked a debater named Extracted for this, and he said logical fallacies and whatever parts of the case seem like they wouldn't really work. Is that it? And if so, how do I get better at seeing them? And third, drilling on my own time. Are there any drills I can do without a partner? This would make practice eminently easier. I'm going to answer 1, 3, and then 2 in that order to get through things pretty quickly. So here we go. Negative strategy on shell and extend. This is actually something I just coached Micah Bach and Blake Toman on today because they lost all 3 negative rounds at North Carolina National Open. And as a coach, kind of funny because after the round that I saw, which was in the middle of the tournament, I said, hey, you guys are running inherency and disadvantages, the classic contradiction. And also, it doesn't seem like you have a cohesive theme. Well, judging by their round 6 ballot, where they also lost their neg, the judge wrote that their arguments as to the status quo's advantages and then running a disadvantage were apparently contradictory, and that's why they lost. So shell and extend really helps a negative team here. I think of shell and extend as, first of all, something where you have to mentally hack as neg to just think you're AF. As AF, if you were walking into the debate round and your plan was whatever today's status quo is, and today's status quo is actually whatever the affirmative plan is, what would you be advocating? What would your case structure be? And I think if you ask yourself that question, you will probably come up with far fewer whiny arguments and far more of a cohesive strategy that drives home a central thesis or a core theme. So instead of having 13 solvency arguments or 8 DAs, you have one big disadvantage. Just the same as in a case, you should really have one really nicely developed harm answered by one really nicely developed advantage, or 2 really nicely developed justifications, or a goal that links to an advantage. Those are the sorts of things we've written about on this blog. So how does that actually look? Here's an example. I wanted to draw on one story that I haven't told before at any debate camps, so we can kind of add this to the collection of stories. This is from double octa finals in 2004 at NCFCA Nationals. This is before STOA existed, so NCFCA Nationals included everybody. And I was debating in double octa finals, unfortunately, against 2, I guess I shouldn't name them, I don't know if I should name them or not, 2 people that I debated the same round, double octa finals, the year before, and closely beat on affirmative that year when they ran 13 disadvantages and 6 solvency points and 4 inherency points and so on. And with our free trade case, which we've written about multiple times on this blog, we're able to outweigh all of these disadvantages on the theory of competition, even though we didn't necessarily address each one line by line. That worked the year before. This time we were neg, and their case was, this was protectorate year, and their case was about microloans in Puerto Rico. And we had never hit a case about microloans in Puerto Rico the entire year, but Amy and I, who are from the same club of 4 people, and Lisa Alexander, our coach that year, we had extensively researched this topic. This is one of the ones that we had a brief on and we're kind of hoping to hit, and so we got to deploy our strategy in this negative round. And I still think of this round as one of the prime examples of what really clicked for me my final year of high school debate, which was this mental hack of being affirmative when I'm negative, having a case. And so we really had a goal, we had one clear theme, and everything we said, disadvantages, which are really harms to the new status quo, and advantages of the current status quo, which are really advantages of our plan, the status quo. Those all really connected together to give us incredibly high-performing speaking as well as a cohesive strategy that felt and looked exactly like shell and extend should. So from the brief, though, I just went and pulled up that brief. I know it was 2004, but thankfully Amy still had it. This is in the days before Dropbox and the cloud, so you had to store it on hard drives, and I had a 32 megabyte hard drive. So anyway, way back then, Puerto Rico microloans was the case, and here are the arguments that are in the brief. These are the strongest arguments in the brief. It was a 17-page brief. There were more arguments in this, actually, but we could argue that banks are better lenders than the Small Business Administration, which is who you have to use to provide microloans on behalf of the federal government. We could argue that Puerto Rico's economy is thriving, and we actually have really good numbers on increasing amounts of small businesses in particular, as well as the economy growth overall. This was, again, a while ago. Big business is threatening small business. We could argue that you can't do anything about the through microloans because you've got to arm small businesses enough to out-compete with big businesses. We could argue there's a welfare mentality in Puerto Rico. We could argue that there are direct lending costs that are uniquely caused by the United States government. Whenever the United States government is a direct lender, the Congressional Budget Office found that there was something like $1.5 billion cost per year for some program that they were looking at. I forget exactly what it was. Puerto Rico already has microlending, is actually a very strong argument. There are 100,000 small businesses at the time already, many of whom were participating in microloans. And then the eligibility criteria could be unclear, which means that the affirmative team's plan might be, I don't know, too hard for people to actually qualify for, or perhaps too easy. And so we were ready to balance that based on the exact nature of their plan, which we didn't know, of course, before the round. If we ran all of these, and I would argue after watching some negative rounds, some of you are arguing twice as many arguments, you spread yourself too thin. And we would spread ourselves too thin to do that. You wouldn't be able to say, here's a compelling theme, and you'd end up making the classic debater mistake, intermediate debater mistake, really, of contradicting yourself by arguing inherency and disadvantages at the same time. So instead, what we did in the round itself, and we won 3-0, was we came up with this as a theme and a strategy. The theme was think local. And the goal or criteria that we used, we only had one, and we said, this is what in the round the judge ought to weigh policy by, is incentives. And we said, local incentives are most likely to provide the greatest benefit in Puerto Rico. As a result, we had 4 primary arguments, all of which fit under the theme of think local, but each of which had multiple subpoints. And this is the key. This is your shell. So in the 1NC, the first negative speech, you want to provide these 4, I call them buckets, but they're categories of argument, all supporting the theme. Argue the theme, provide the buckets. Then in the rest of the speeches, all you're doing is adding more and more warrants. What's a warrant? It's a fact, it's a quotation, it's a new reason to support the conclusion. So you end up with tons and tons of warrants supporting each of these conclusions, each of these buckets. That means that the 2NC, the 1NR, and the 2NR all have a very clear path forward, but so does cross-examination. Everything is about building warrants into these buckets and supporting the idea that this theme is valuable. So we said local banks are more incented to make great decisions when it comes to loans, because ultimately a loan you have to say yes to some and no to others. Local banks have to make money. They have to actually profit. The government doesn't necessarily have to do that, or the way that incentives work for individuals at the government doesn't really work that way. So local banks are the most incented to provide accurate loans if anybody does it all. Local decisions are going to be better by default, meaning people who actually work and live in Puerto Rico rather than people in Washington or wherever it is that SBA applications go to, and honestly I'm speaking out of ignorance here, I don't know how that works, but local decisions are going to have inherently better decisions. And this is primarily a logical argument. We're going to push the affirmative team off balance here, though, and make them prove that somehow they know something about locality or about how the Small Business Administration works that gets around this argument. So we're setting this up really more as a standard than anything. Then, no unique link to the Small Business Association from AF. This came about because of all the research we did. We didn't really find anyone arguing that the federal government should do microloans with Puerto Rico. We found some people advocating more microloans, some people saying no, some people saying do it this way, that way, the other way. But we didn't really find people doing that, and so we predicted before the round that the affirmative team would actually be kind of cobbling together microloans are good and microloans are needed in Puerto Rico, and the federal government ought to be the ones doing them. And we thought, you know what? Let's break that unique link, because as negative, we have ground for everything except the federal government doing these microloans for Puerto Rico. So if their evidence doesn't say, or each piece of support that they use doesn't support the Small Business Administration using microloans, then the negative team, the affirmative team's case isn't really advocated, and we should look to alternative means. For example, and then we had a couple quotes of people saying how microloans should be done by local banks. So perhaps we can turn most of their evidence to support our position that thinking local is the right way to think about this. Last of all, I can't even read my own handwriting. It's that bad. I can type fast, though. I can still talk faster. Okay, if the Small Business Association... if you use the Small Business Association, so this is our hedge. If you use the Small Business Administration, then the Small Business Administration should be used as a guarantor of loans at 50%. We actually had a great card on. Not the direct loaner. In other words, still trust the local banks to make the decision. If you think the federal government needs to actually spark small businesses in Puerto Rico, let the SBA be a backer of these loans, thereby increasing the incentives for local banks to lend. But don't let the government be a direct lender. And we have some really good cards on that. So we've got good cards on these two, more logic here, and that's our strategy. We can wax eloquent about the idea of thinking local, and that's part of the strategy of shelling and extending. So when you shell this out in the 1NC, then all further speeches just supply more reasons on these arguments. You don't add any more than these buckets, these threads of arguments. So if a judge were to say, I have to discount all new arguments, anything that you provide after this point might be a historical example of local banks. And say, you're like J.R. Leslie and you know random historical examples from Rome, and you can actually make this bank argument from Rome. I don't even know if there were banks in Rome. Then you would make that here. You can make that in a later speech, and that's not really a new argument. You're just arguing for the idea of thinking local and that local banks are incented. You're adding new examples and support for the argument lines that are already on the table. And then another key benefit arises, which is cross-examination. When you shell and extend, it doesn't look like this two disjointed debaters who, by the 2NR, come up with voting issues that come together. You look like you're advocating a position. And I know to debaters, especially at age like 14 and 15, when you're still struggling to think in cohesive big picture and integrated thinking, but that's where you want to push yourself. That's rhetoric stage learning. It's very hard to see that it's far more persuasive for someone to take a bold stand on one item than it is for them to provide you a list of 13 possible arguments. The reason is a partially cognitive load, but it's the idea that if a debater who's really a policy advocate has made processed all these arguments and made a decision that this is the most important thing, thinking local, after reviewing everything, then that's one less decision that the judge has to make. The judge is focused on, should we or should we not do this? And the policy advocate has already weighed the best arguments for and against and determined this is the one thing to think about. That makes it simpler for the judge, allows the judge to trust your judgment in the recommendation, and therefore allows you to behave and act as a cohesive unit, recommending a course of action the whole time, instead of a negative team trying to throw stones and hope that one of them breaks the glass. That's a profoundly different way to debate negative, and that's why shell and extend matters, and that's how it works. We have 2 blogs on shell and extend that are on the blog, and I think we actually have a video on the Ethos debate videos. I'm not sure. Feel free to send me questions. Isaiah.mcpeak@ethosdebate.com. You can contact us on our site. If you want to follow up on this, we'll maybe record another video. We could even do an example for you. This kind of is an example. Okay, next, let me erase some of this and talk about the other issues at hand. Yes, I'm highly manual. I'm not pausing the video because guess what? I don't want to edit it. Answering question 3. Drilling on my own time. Are there any drills you can do without your partner? This would make practice eminently easier. Yes, there are 2 primary drills that I would recommend, and the first and foremost is really easy to do, but you have to give yourself some focused time to do it. That's going to YouTube or some other place where you find videos of debaters, pulling down some debates, and joining in the debate. This is really valuable to do. Get your paper all situated so that you can give multiple speeches in the round. And what you want to do is you want to take, say, the 1AC, and then you give the 1NC. So you're listening to the 1AC, flowing it, trying to make responses, and so on. Pretend you have evidence, pretend you don't, I don't know. But make yourself a 1NC, try to beat that case. Then see what the actual 1NC did in the round. And then maybe switch your mindset to affirmative and answer as the 2AC. You don't have to do it for every speech, but you kind of get the idea there that one of the best ways to practice on your own is to take videos of other people debating and debate and then see what actually happened. So I would say take high-level debates or take college debates, go watch them, and try to practice putting yourself in that position and analyze how other people treated it. Second, classical rhetoric says one of the best ways to learn is through imitation. So another thing you would do is watch someone give a speech and then try to give a similar speech yourself. So here you're looking to, whereas in the first one you're really focusing on the arguments and trying to line by line attack the other team and provide a great strategy. Here you are trying to adapt your style to someone else's style that is successful and good. So you want to copy what they do and feel the impact of practicing. You want to feel yourself forming great habits. Okay, third of all, let's see. Drills to do without your partner. One of them is, it's not really a drill, but think through cross-examination and use lines of questioning. What I really try to teach people to do with their questions is instead of thinking it as one question, think of it about 8 to 12 questions, any particular question you have, because you want to find agreement. And you want to find agreement with what's coming up next, not what the person just spoke about. So you're really focusing on your turf. The way I think of that is, if here's my big point that I want to make in cross-examination, how can I make it into sub-points? And then if somebody gets confused or doesn't answer me right, sometimes I have to go sub-sub to get them back to where I wanted to go, to get back on track, like this. So one of the best things you can do is go to your affirmative and say, how could I cross-examine to get someone to naturally agree with my affirmative case? And you want to build up this line by line, just like, isn't it true that, wouldn't you agree with me that, isn't it true that, really the tiniest pieces possible to make it so that it's painfully obvious, leading towards the conclusion. And of course, in cross-examination, you never go too far. You never actually make the conclusion in cross-examination. This is something you can try out on parents and friends. If you have it right, no matter what they know or don't know about a topic, they'll have to follow you through these questions. It's very Socratic, like, isn't it true, Glaucon, that the United States would prefer to not have as many enemies in the Middle East? Boom, that's little one. Okay, if that's so, would you agree that Iran is one of the people that we consider an enemy over there? Yeah, okay, good. So given that Iran is an enemy, would you agree with me that there's a huge difference between the religious leaders, the government, and the people of Iran? They don't have a clue. Oh, okay, and then you could go around or you could skip on. Assuming that that were the case, wouldn't it be true that? And you keep going. And so that would be a way to practice on regular people. Fourth and finally, this one always surprises debaters. Just deliver your case to somebody or deliver a strategy that doesn't know anything about debate but is perfectly intelligent, like a neighbor, most people, and then see what they say. No explanation, you're a pure learner. Just deliver your case and see what they say. Ask them at the end, what did you hear me say? What was important? What even was my plan? You will be flabbergasted, I promise you, the first few times and you'll think people are stupid. But then at some point you'll realize it's a failure in your own communication because you have thought about this idea so many times, so many different ways, and filtered a ton of information down to its bare essentials to fit into a speech. And the other person lacks all of that background. And you'll be amazed at what people think your case actually does if they can even tell you what it does at all. And you'll find yourself improving in how you methodically explain where you're going and ultimately connecting this to shall and extend. You'll see how less is more when it comes to debate. Find and prioritize the arguments for your audience so that you can focus on what's most important rather than trying to spread them thin on really what is both argument and education for them, and their mind is just like going this way and that. Okay, last, third question, which was the second question, whatever. Neg with no evidence. What mindset should you have to find arguments? Someone said logical fallacies, whatever parts of the case seem like they wouldn't really work. Is that it, and how do you get better at seeing them? Okay, logical fallacies, if I were to say, going negative without evidence, we'll do a little pie chart here. I would argue, wow, that's a terrible line, that going negative without evidence is about this much. It's about 10% of your pie chart. I really hope that's close to 10%. Going to logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are about 10% of going neg without evidence. You're not really pointing out that many logical fallacies. That honestly doesn't happen that much. I think, though, what is meant there is you're pointing out misapplications of supporting material, i.e. evidence, quotes. That is a huge part of debate, but still, I would say it's about 10% of your negative strategy, is you're saying, this person didn't really advocate the conclusion that you see the affirmative team drew from it. In fact, what they're supporting seems to support some other thing. I would say that going negative without evidence, though, involves a couple other things. First of all, remember what evidence really is. Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian developed the idea of the common topics, which are handed down in rhetoric. Evidence, meaning support, as a common topic in rhetoric, first canon discovery, includes quotations, maxims, like proverbs, statistics, historical examples, personal example, analogies, logic, and the law. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Good. These are the common topics in rhetoric under the topic of support, meaning this is all evidence. This is considered evidence. So don't short sell yourself on your education. Your historical examples are huge when it comes to debating here. Historical examples play a major role in debating without evidence. To do that, you're going to absolutely need a strategy. That, to me, is the biggest part about being negative. When you don't have a cohesive strategy, even without evidence, meaning you have no goals, you have no criteria, you have no ability to show and extend because you have no theme. When you're missing all that stuff, you really don't have, you're fighting a tough battle the whole time. You gotta have a strategy. What's the big idea the judge should be believing in? Is it that the status quo is fine? Or, more likely, is it that there's some better way of going about it than the affirmative team? Because remember, if you hit a squirrel, most likely the affirmative team is going over here and saying, here's some issue I want to talk about. Over here and saying, ooh, the topic isn't really about that, but I'm going to kind of make it about that. And then over here and saying, here's some evidence and research that supports this, but doesn't support that. And they're trying to squeeze academic research into a Middle Eastern-shaped hole. And it doesn't really fit there because the academics aren't really saying that. If they are, then most likely is either a tiny, tiny, tiny issue, meaning it's subject to topicality argumentation, and you shouldn't be afraid of that, or it's something that you should have researched. So I'm just assuming that you've been working relatively hard on the Middle Eastern topic, and you're able to form a strategy in when someone is kind of squeezing information into the topic that doesn't really belong. Next you have off case. Off case includes critiques if they exist, usually not, counterplans, disads, and topicality. Should probably make this a little bit bigger. Like that. These are your off case arguments. You need to formulate a counterplan, 2 DAs, or a topicality or 2 in order to really succeed. My favorite combination whenever I'm against a squirrel is, can I think of a way to do their idea better that I could steal their evidence? I can advocacy steal and say, you know what, it seems to really not be fitting into the topic because that evidence would actually support this other policy that's bigger, smaller, different, somehow, different agency, different focus, who knows how it's different. But that counterplan, then I have to build a disadvantage on the distance between their plan and the counterplan, and I'm going to use their own advocacy against them. That's my favorite way to deal with the negative case. I mean the negative that I don't have any evidence on. Then, last of all, mandate analysis. There have been so many cases that I've beaten by demonstrating flaws in the mandates, down to individual words or how the mandate actually links to their advantage and the amount of advantage that it actually achieves. Mandate analysis is absolutely massive. This usually comes out best in the 2NC. After you've really analyzed the case, you still need a strategy earlier on and probably some form of off-case argumentation, but then the mandate analysis can really be a killer in a squirrel because usually people are kind of making up whatever their mandate is since nobody's really advocating it. And being able to poke holes and analyze that is a huge thing to rely on. I feel like I'm missing something really important about handling squirrels, and it'll probably come to me in a second. So when you are negative and you don't have any evidence, the worst types of things you can do are inherency arguments, arguing fixing the status quo, and saying, I don't have any evidence. You do have evidence. All this stuff. But in addition to that, you need to have generic quotations about the topic that you can fit into any round. These have to do with a grand vision. And that's what I'd like to leave you with here tonight, is if you have a grand vision for the Middle East, these sorts of questions will become less bothersome. If someone is arguing, repeal this rinky-dink deal that we have with a subset of a subset of Egypt's government, they might be absolutely right. In fact, they probably are, and you can even admit that. But when it comes to what this topic is asking us to grapple with. And when it comes to how we should think about Egypt and the Middle East in general, if you have a grander vision for the Middle East, the United States should be less antagonistic towards them. Or, the United States needs to prepare for the oncoming apocalypse. Whatever it is, you need to have a grand vision for how that ought to work out. Which countries should be involved in the solution. These sorts of generic approaches that say, I have imagined a better future for the United States and the Middle East and all parties involved. If you've researched those, then you will find that each case fits into the context of your grand vision somehow. And if you have one or two grand visions, then inevitably most cases contradict the grand vision in some way, shape, or form. For example, I would say engage, don't isolate the Middle East would be one of my largest grand visions. Second, multilateral solutions would be one of the other largest grand visions, given that there are so many countries involved in the region. Those two grand visions are going to contradict the idea behind probably 70% of cases that are out there. And if I'm well researched and articulate about that, I can make a tiny case issue be about a much larger issue, about the principle of the matter of how the future should look in the Middle East. And that's where you really want to be focusing as a negative team. That's inspiring, it's meaningful, and it shows it's contextual. It's something that your judge is thinking about before they hear about some policy they've never heard of before, is how do we fix the Middle East? And that's really the challenge of the topic this year, and I hope it's a challenge that you are engaging in and trying to solve, because painting that picture, that's a key outcome for studying this topic for a year and learning to grapple with all the tiny little decisions that we make that contradict a bigger picture. That's one of the largest challenges in policy making that we have to overcome. And so I hope you'll engage in being part of overcoming that challenge by thinking of a better tomorrow for U.S. policy in general, and then contextualizing the tiny things that affirmative teams talk about into that grander whole. Thank you.